Welcome to review for Management 481. Today we are going to go over the key terms from Chapter 4. Let's get into it. All right, our first term is activities. These are distinct business processes that enable firms to transform inputs into goods and services. So of course, you know the word activities. This in the business context is just saying it is what happens to create value. You input something, a business will input ideas or raw materials, and then that will turn into goods and services that people want. The next term is another one you've probably heard. It is capabilities. These are organizational and managerial skills necessary to orchestrate a diverse set of resources and deploy them strategically. Sometimes this book makes definitions a little more wordy than needed. Capabilities is basically the capacity that a manager has to allocate resources efficiently. Next is causal ambiguity. This is a situation in which the cause and effect of a phenomenon are not readily apparent. So causal ambiguity is when you make a decision in business and you don't really know what the outcome will be. It's ambiguous, as they would say. Next is core competencies. These are unique strengths embedded within a firm that are critical to gaining and sustaining a competitive advantage. So this book talks a lot about competitive advantages, and the main point of a business is to sustain them. So the core competencies are strengths that allow you to sustain that advantage. Next is core rigidity. Core rigidity, this is how it's spelled, taken from the word rigid, I assume. It's a former core competency that turned into a liability because the firm failed to hone, refine, or upgrade the competency as the environment changed. This is fascinating. Something that used to be a strength may become a weakness. So an example of this, I always think of soccer when it comes to when doing Management 481 for some reason. Core rigidity may be a strength, like when you were younger, you might have been the biggest kid so you could kind of push other people around. But as the environment began to change and other people became your same size, you didn't evolve the skills needed to keep up. So now you being bigger is not an asset but a liability. So that would be one example. Next is costly to imitate resource. This is one of the four key criteria in the VRIO framework. A resource is costly to imitate if a firm that does not possess the resource are unable to develop or buy the resource at a comparable cost. So basically, if you have access to a resource and other people need to spend a lot of money or effort or time to get that resource, that is a costly to imitate resource, and if you have a lot of those, then that will give you a sustained competitive advantage. Next is dynamic capabilities. This is a firm's ability to create, deploy, modify, reconfigure, upgrade, or leverage its resources in its quest for a competitive advantage. That was a little wordy. Basically, dynamic capabilities is how adaptable a firm is. Next is dynamic capabilities perspective. This is a model that emphasizes a firm's ability to modify and leverage its resource base in a way that enables it to gain an advantage in a constantly changing environment. So it's difficult, this chapter, because a lot of the words or terms are pretty similar, but basically dynamic capabilities perspective is saying, all right, you have that resource that is costly to imitate, but it's also in a changing environment. You might start off with a resource that's costly to imitate because no one has that scalability that you have, or no one knows how to make it, but as the environment changes, people are going to learn, so keeping that advantage is pretty difficult. Next is an intangible resource. This is resources that do not have physical attributes and are thus invisible. Tangible means you can touch it, so intangible means you can't touch it. Thus, an intangible resource is one that you can't touch. An example of this might be like a good relationship with a supplier. That's going to be hard to replicate. Next is intellectual property protection. This is a critical intangible resource that can provide a strong isolating mechanism and thus helps sustain a competitive advantage. So intellectual property, you might have heard of like people are having lawsuits over intellectual property. Basically, it's where intellectual property is like, all right, I have this idea or I have this concept, and having it protected means like, oh, if you steal it, you're going to be sued. So if you have it protected, that is a resource because then other people can't come and take it. Next is isolating mechanisms. These are barriers to imitate that prevent rivals from competing away the advantage a firm may enjoy. So an isolating mechanism is kind of like a wall that that stops your competition from having your same advantage. So an example of an isolating mechanism might be, well, like we just talked about, intellectual property protection. That can be one of those walls that you have up. Next is organized to capture value. This is one of the 4 key criteria of the VRIO framework again. So this would be the O. This is the characteristic of having in place an effective organizational structure, organized to capture value. So basically, when your structure is organized, it allows you to capture value more, of course. Next is path dependence. This is a situation in which the options one faces in the current situation are limited by decisions made in the past. So sometimes I feel like this in life, like, I guess growing up, when you're a kid, you think, oh, the possibilities are endless, but when you make decisions, the more decisions you make, the more narrow your path is. Like at this point, I could not be an Olympic weightlifter. The decisions I've made have put me on this path where it's gonna take a lot of choices to do that. Or it basically is saying your current choices are limited by past decisions, which can be kind of upsetting to think about, but it's also kind of helpful when you don't have unlimited decisions and you have, knowledge of what works. Next is primary activities. These are firm activities that add value directly by transforming inputs into outputs as the firm moves a product or service horizontally along the internal value chain. Primary activities. So we learned about activities basically being transferring or transforming inputs into value. This is specifically when that happens because a service moves horizontally up and down along the internal value chain. I'm thinking this means like either public opinion changes about how valuable something is or the product becomes more valuable. But basically, primary activity is like an activity where the value is going to go up. A rare resource. This is also the VRIO framework. This is a resource that a firm possesses, and the thing that makes it rare is it is less than the number of firms it would require to reach the state of perfect competition. Basically, it's hard to come by. Next is a resource, any asset, capability, or competency that benefits the firm. And a resource-based view is a model that sees certain types of resources as a key to superior firm performance. I believe everyone would have a resource-based view, like your resources are what make you valuable, but that's what that view is. Next is resource flows. This is the firm's level of investments to maintain or build an intangible resource. So how invested is that firm to keep up with the resource? Some resources might not be rare or valuable anymore, so they'd have you wouldn't be really concerned about the resource flow there. Okay, resource heterogeneity. I always like the homo, when they have that etymology, because I feel so smart because I'm like, oh, hetero means different. So resource heterogeneity, this is how it's spelled, means an assumption in the resource-based view that a firm is a bundle of resources and capabilities that differ across firms. So we got it, they're different. So of course resources and capabilities will be different across different firms, but that is that idea there. Resource immobility. This is an assumption in the resource-based view that a firm has resources that tend to be sticky and that do not move easily from firm to firm. So the ultimate of that would be like copyrighted material. That has zero resource immobility, or that has high resource immobility, zero resource mobility, because unless you buy it from someone, they have the rights to it, so it's not going to move from firm to firm. Next is resource stocks. This is the firm's current level of intangible resources. So I guess what do you have in the stock room? That's your resource stocks. Next is social complexity. This is a situation in which different social and business systems interact with one another. Next is a strategic activity system. This is the conceptualization of a firm as a network of interconnected activities. So basically saying a firm is just a bunch of activities that come together to make value. Next is a strategic fit. This occurs when an organization matches its internal resources and capabilities to external environment. So basically, someone's what the firm is giving is what other people need. Next is support activities. These are firm activities that add value indirectly but are necessary to sustain primary activities. So, like we talked about, prime activities is basically transferring input into value, like making your products more valuable. Support activities might be something like filing your taxes. That's not necessarily adding value to the product, but it's something that is necessary to support the business and adds value indirectly, because if you're not doing your taxes, then you're going to get into trouble. It's going to be shady for your investors. Activities that don't necessarily make the product more valuable but are necessary would be support activities. All right, this is in every management class. You ought to know it by now if you're a management major like I. SWOT analysis. SWOT, this is basically a framework that looks at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to a business. Tangible resources, like we talked about, resources that can be touched, physical attributes. Next is a valuable resource. This is one of the 4 criteria in the VRIO framework. A resource is valuable if it helps a firm exploit an external opportunity or offset an external threat. So basically something that adds value to the company. Value chain, the internal activities a firm engages in when transforming inputs into outputs. And so the idea here is that each activity adds value. That's not necessarily true, because sometimes the customers like stuff simple, and if you keep adding, it's going to be complicated. But the idea is as the product goes through the chain, it'll get more and more value. And our final one is VRIO framework. We've talked a lot about this. This is a theoretical framework that explains and predicts firm-level competitive advantage. So, the VRIO framework, let's see if we can, that's all for the review. Let's just see if we can get the acronym real quick. V is for valuable resources. Then R, let's see what that was. Is for rare resource, so it should be valuable, rare. I is for I thought we had an I here. Oh, immediate, imitation costly. So is it imitation costly? No, then there's only a temporary competitive advantage, but if it's imitation costly, then you have that kind of barrier. Then O is for organized to capture value. So is a resource in the VRIO framework, here's kind of the model we're looking at. Is a resource valuable? Yes. Is it rare? Yes. Does it cost a lot to imitate or make the same thing? Yes. Is it organized to capture value? Yes. Well, then you have a competitive, sustainable advantage. If it's not valuable, no one's going to want it. If it's not rare, you're not going to have an advantage. If it's not costly to imitate, then everybody can do it. And if it's not organized to capture value, then it's just going to be a temporary competitive advantage. So there you go. This is chapter 4. Hope this was helpful.